Two worlds, two guiding lights, two people, one life. Can two civilizations so different in history move beyond their mutual curiosity, pleasure, fear, and desire, and come to understanding? This is a story of what is and what might be, about you and me, a story of true possibility. Chapter 1. Coming to Consciousness. Two people passed from behind my car forward up the road. I observed their passing from behind the steering wheel and watched as the man, a Westerner, reached up and gently pressed his mostly closed fist into his female partner's back, rolling the heel of his palm here and there in gentle calculation. At the moment I observed this and commented to myself about the tenderness that was on display, at the very moment I was going to mention it to the passenger in the seat next to me, both the man and the woman turned, as if having the same thought, and looked directly at me, watching them. How did I react? Did I ignore it? Not really. I'm recalling it to you now. Did I say to myself, isn't that a funny thing? At the same moment I'm thinking of their tenderness, they look back at me. Well, I did do that, but I did not treat it as anything strange or coincidental. What I did is become aware that the couple before me, immersed in a warm and solitary awareness of one another, an intimate and closed tenderness, spontaneously moved in a unified motion, an unpremeditated and precise recognition that someone else was quietly observing their spiritual companionship. The man and the woman turned, as if having the same thought, and that wordless communion recognized me for the briefest of moments. And rather than thinking of the event as a mathematical improbability, I considered it an existential certainty. We three shared consciousness and the same liquid delight for a brief, eternal moment. I'm noticing this kind of experience more and more. I saw something else recently. There is a video on YouTube called When Korean Kid Meet American Kid for the First Time. Yoon-Hyo Carson, Episode 1. It was posted less than 2 years ago, and to date it has 62 million views. If you haven't seen the video yet, this is what takes place. A Korean boy and an American girl walk straight out from the camera and then immediately turn side-face, he on the left, she on the right, looking directly at each other. They are in a room with a plain white backdrop, she with her hands folded in front of her wearing a skirt with a mustard jacket, and he with his hands at his sides, casual pants, and a light gray cardigan over a white t-shirt. From their appearance, they seem poised at just that point where you can imagine both what they might have looked like as younger children and what they will look like as the adults they will soon enough be. They appear comfortable in their own shoes, and yet nervous with anticipation. They stand in silence, looking each other in the eyes, approximately 1.5 paces apart. He glances at the camera and she glances at the ceiling. He smiles shyly while his eyes narrow. She purses her lips, suppressing nervous laughter, no doubt, and her eyes twinkle while he glances again at the camera. Finally he makes his move, and bows a very quick Korean bow from the hips. She bows back, in an unpracticed and playful mimic, no doubt unaware of how normal it is for him to make this first sign of humble formality. They pause, again searching each other's eyes for a clue about what to do next. He bows again, this time less effectively, and she quickly nods her head, then turns to the camera with a look that seems to say, "What the heck is happening?" Yet while she does this, he then waves his hand at her at about chest level, this time smiling a bit more freely, and she replies in kind. She smiles more, eyes sparkling again as she begins rocking on her feet and looking back at the camera. He asks, "What's your name?" She replies, "Carlson." "Ah," he says, smiling and glancing at the camera. She replies, "What's your name?" She lifts her right leg back while standing on one foot. He says his name in Korean, Yin Shin, and she mispronounces it back to him, Yonosi. He nods and asks, "How old are you?" She misunderstands and replies, "Good." It eventually becomes clear that he doesn't know that much English, and he pulls out a translator that he has on his phone, which is in his front pocket. They continue to exchange information with the use of the translator mediating their understanding. Toward the end of the 4-minute exchange, he asks her favorite song, and she replies, "Tightrope, from The Greatest Showman." He nods, appearing to know, but likely not. She closes the gap between them, stepping forward and reaching out to hold the phone together with him. Leaning into him, she searches YouTube to find the song, then steps back, looking up into his eyes as it begins to play. The short encounter between her and the boy comes to a close as the video fades, playing out with these lyrics. "Some people long for a life that is simple and planned, tied with a ribbon. Some people won't sail the sea, 'cause they're safer on land. To follow what's written, but I'd follow you to the great unknown." I want to tell you a story about this hidden glowing, this moon of the soul spreading its silver sheen like pixie dust on each leafy tree branch or field of grass. A glowing that seems to exude out from some place, or every place all at once, like music floating in the air, or the whisper of wind. I wish to draw our attention back to that which is deeper than mathematics. But to do so, I need an instrument on which to play my song. The instrument I choose is the written word, and the tune I shall employ is that of a story, a very ordinary story of regular people from two very different lands. She is a young Chinese girl, born in the middle of China's Cultural Revolution to a father, Qianlong, who served in the military, and a mother, Juyu, who worked as a clerk at a distribution center in a small village east of Shanghai. He is a Canadian boy, born in the middle of the feminist revolution. His mother, Hannah, barely 15 years old, had dropped out of high school to raise her son, and his father, Ben, a businessman, owned and managed 3 Smitty's Pancake House restaurants. Ben lived in Dawson Creek in central British Columbia, while Hannah lived in a small village in central Saskatchewan with her mother Ava and sometime father Alexander. Each child was born into a matrix of hope and challenge, the daylight on one side of the world being moonlight on the other. The boy's name is Bobby Young. The Chinese girl is Yinlin Dai. It is 1977, and Yinlin is sitting beside her father Qianlong. He is holding a large book containing family photos. They have several such books, but this one is the oldest and one of the heaviest. It rests on both his lap and hers. It was rare for a family to have such luxury as a photo album, but because Tianlong was an officer in the army, he was able to procure certain benefits that evaded ordinary people. Not only was a military man superior to the normal social categories in China, but as an officer, Tianlong was provided with an executive assistant. The assistant would not only supply clerical support, but do more domestic services such as launder clothes and accompany Tianlong on his travels. And more particularly, he took many family photos using the military's camera, even learning over time how to develop the photos. Yinlin pointed her finger at a black and white photo of herself as a baby, perhaps 8 months, taking a bath. The tub was metal with handles on front and back. Inside and above the water level, the metal glistened and light reflected brightly from the front portion of the tub. "Do you remember when Comrade Wen took this photo?" her father asked. "You were so naughty, you see. You were splashing water and getting it everywhere." The photo was familiar to Yinlin, though she had no direct memory of the time. She seemed to recall indirectly, through her imagination and recall of previous conversations. She felt as if she could remember the occasion. Perhaps she simply remembered the memory she once had of that time. Yinlin loved this photo. Something about it made her happy. Was it happiness she perceived in the image of her smile? Was it the lively splashing gesture, the glinting light, her bare skin appearing creamy white in the photo? Perhaps it was the warmth in her father's voice as he described the occasion of her naughty behavior. It is possible also that she associated this photo with the early years of her life, when Yinlin and her mother would stay with her father at the army barracks. Yes, she missed those days. When they stayed at the barracks, Yinlin was able to see her father at his best. There he was a man in charge. Other soldiers saluted him and did his bidding. While his directives were basically impenetrable adult language to her, the respect she observed from the junior soldiers was obvious. She knew that her father was loved, and because of this Yinlin also felt loved. Not only so, but other soldiers' families were also at the barracks, including their children. And Yinlin's mother didn't need to do much except take care of her daughter, which, apart from the usual feeding and clothing, meant primarily watching her child play with the other children in the play area. It was a life of ease in those days compared to their neighbors back home. Meals were served in the cafeteria where all the soldiers and their families gathered. Food was abundant, served in a buffet style so much that the soldiers would even throw out pieces of uneaten chicken. It was an earthly paradise because no one at home would ever have such a thing. This made her family far more privileged than the neighbors, who were lucky to taste a small piece of chicken perhaps only once a year, at New Year's. Recently her mother had cooked a chicken, and one of the neighbor girls, having smelled the aroma floating in the air, stood outside the entrance of their home with a look of longing and desire. Yinlin had become accustomed to the social status they enjoyed as the result of her father's work with the army, and her mother gave a piece of the chicken wing to Yinlin. "Go, give this to that girl outside." Yinlin poked her head out the door and handed the chicken to the girl. There was a brief but silent exchange in their eyes. Then Yinlin closed the door and came bouncing back into the house. She looked out the window. The girl outside was gone. Tianlong, looking at this photo with his daughter, also had good memories, and he was proud of how far they had come. His early life had not been so comfortable, miserable in fact. Qianlong was born in a small village near the coast east of Shanghai. They were in Japanese-occupied territory, though it was rare in those parts to see any soldiers. 7 years earlier, Japan invaded Nanking and murdered hundreds of thousands of its citizens. Qianlong's family, living as they did in a poor region, did not realize till late that a massive Chinese migration had taken place as a result of the Japanese occupation and advance into China. The Chinese government and 30 million citizens dismantled or secreted away on barges and ox carts 70% of its production capacity to Chongqing. There they formed cooperatives and rebuilt their factories inside the bellies of mountains. By this strategy, the Chinese gained time to build up a resistance, while the Japanese consolidated power along China's eastern frontier. After the course of 8 years, with China's increasing power to resist and Japan's engagement in war on other fronts, Japan's dominance in the region came to a sudden end when Emperor Hirohito issued orders for the soldiers to lay down their arms. On August 29, 1945, the instrument of surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay. The Japanese troops withdrew from China, leaving a chaotic confusion about who was managing the population and infrastructure that remained behind. China's former unity in the face of Japanese aggression broke down into 4 further years of civil war. 2 visions of China struggled for ascendancy between the nationalists and the communists, while Qianlong's family grabbed whatever small threads of tattered cloth they could gather and applied themselves to the daily labor of survival. In one respect, Qianlong and his family were lucky. They lived in the countryside near the ocean and several streams. Because they lived here, they were not exposed to the worst atrocities of Japanese occupation, nor were they influenced greatly by either the nationalists or the communists. Propagandists from either side came through their village trying to gain support for their cause, but more often than not, the strangers that came to their home brought nothing but their hunger. The communists gained power in 1949 and slowly began to reorganize the country according to their political vision. China was building a house with sticks, and Qianlong joined with his countrymen. In the summer they ate dust. In the winter their skin cracked till bleeding from exposure to the cold. Robbers would raid villages in the night, and when Chinese New Year came around, only those who had hidden their food carefully would have anything left on New Year's Day to make happy. Qianlong's mother knew how to make a handful of rice stretch across all the bowls of their family, and in the midst of this struggle and paranoia, never refused the hunger of a wandering stranger. Qianlong admired his mother's wide-open heart and sought to emulate those qualities in his own life. At school he was seen as a leader and rose to the level of president of the school council. And on his 2-hour walks home from school, Qianlong would greet the neighbors and help with anything they might need, even if it was simply a need for company with a young and enthusiastic man. The neighbors so appreciated him that Qianlong often came home with a small gift of rice or a few beans. Qianlong was the shortest of 4 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister, because his teen years, which should have been years of physical growth, took place around 1960, which were famine years later called the 3 Years Nature Disaster. Considered by some to have been the greatest man-made disaster in human history, the Chinese government intended to strengthen China by placing people into communes. But this new social organization complicated food supply and was further mishandled by the movement of capable farmers from the land and farming traditions they loved to become novices at iron and steel production. In addition, In order to improve the size of China's rice basket, China implemented a Smash Sparrows campaign. Sparrows were estimated to eat 4 pounds of grain per year, and given there was a food shortage, were identified as enemies of the state. All over the vast country of China, sparrow nests were destroyed, eggs smashed, and the young were killed. It is said that sparrows would find shelter in various diplomatic missions who refused to participate in sparrow killing. However, dedicated Chinese citizens were not deterred. They surrounded the offending diplomatic missions day and night while banging on pots and pans without rest. Because of this noise, the sparrows could not settle, and dropped to the ground dead from exhaustion. Shovels were needed to clean out the grounds of these diplomatic missions. After the fall of the sparrows came the rise of the locust population, and not long after that, the resulting fall of Chinese bodies, for which there were not enough shovels. It has been said, but no one can be sure because this period has also been called Mao's secret famine, that a person traveling through the countryside would, during the worst of times, have seen dogs feeding on any hundreds of Chinese bodies laying about on the ground. Others have rightly argued that this cannot be true, as the dogs would have long ago been eaten by the Chinese. In those days, for many Chinese, survival depended on one's wits and determination. Not only must one be willing to make a meal from the bark of trees, or the boiled leather of an old plow harness, or a few shreds of gathered grass, but one had to find it. Fortunately, while the land gave up little produce, Qianlong and his family were sometimes able to collect a small basket of river snails and a shellfish or two. More rarely, perhaps the occasional fish. These would be cooked over a hot pan or grill, with bits of onion or garlic, if such could be found, and rice boiled into a thin soup. If word spread, a neighbor might bring a yam while joining together in the meal, now becoming something of a feast. Though uncommon, such meals occurred on enough occasions to bring their bodies back from starvation and minds from despair. Compared to those early days when all Qianlong's memory was the daily experience of hunger, life now was quite pleasant. Yet, despite the ease of life at the barracks, Qianlong's memory of early days were years of happiness. He was a member of the lucky generation, born under the red flag of communism. And while they lacked in material supply, Qianlong's increasingly dominant feeling over the years of his life was of a sad longing for the utopian dream of his young adulthood. Qianlong was a true believer in the dignity of all people. He believed, deep in his heart, that if each person worked hard to achieve prosperity and strength for the country, then each person, in turn, would gain a share in its benefits. Qianlong's youthful years of generosity gave him many opportunities. No doubt his eagerness to be a leader in helping the community and his loyalty to communist ideals eased his advance in the military. He kept a journal in which he made daily reflections. Frequently, the entries would begin with a slogan, such as, "Serve the people," which he always followed with considerations of how he succeeded or failed in serving the people that day. Another slogan was, "Never benefit oneself, always benefit others," after which followed Qianlong's careful analysis of which parts of society appeared to serve people better, which parts should be improved, and what action he would take the following day to make such improvements. And when he appeared especially discouraged with the challenges of life, he reflected on tireless struggle. Reading this journal, one came away with little sense of who Qianlong was. Rather, the feeling after reading several hundreds of pages was that of a mood of dissatisfaction and striving, dissatisfaction with present conditions, and bitter struggle for a not yet realized bright future, mixed with gratitude to Chairman Mao, who both delivered and was still delivering a better China, a new China. Christians in the West, particularly evangelicals, might hear echoes of the kingdom of God being present now, but not yet fully established. At the end of every reflection, Qianlong concluded with the words, "Long, long live Chairman Mao," which sounds little different than "Praise God and Hallelujah" does in the Western world. The impression was given that there was a hard struggle between the powers of good and evil, and all the goodness, all that was worthwhile, every solid bridge, every stable home, every ray of sunshine emanated from the great chairman, who was the captain of Chinese salvation. Love and devotion to Chairman Mao, and dedication to the good of the country, was what every decent person believed, and any preservation of personal or private interest was to be banished. In later years, Qianlong would grow to hate the capitalist perversions of the utopian dream that fueled his daily reflections. These perversions were everywhere apparent around the turn of the century as capitalism gained a foothold in the larger cities of China. Part of Qianlong's hate was a natural outcome. As his ideals became less and less relevant, as the new generation became more focused on the tireless struggle for benefits rather than the people, so he too became irrelevant. The new generation of Chinese considered people like him naive. He, and what had been then called New China, would feel himself to be one of the olds, not so much discarded as the merchants and intelligentsia of his day who were sent to the countryside or disappeared. No, this generation was different. As he aimed to benefit others, those younger others sought to benefit from him and his generation. The devotion of the new generation became reframed, not as devotion to countrymen, but a hunger to be more clever, more excellent than one's neighbor, and take advantage of weakness in order to build private empires of ambitious acquisition. The symbols of this acquisition became demonstrations of China's increasing power. Both young and old took pride in this progress. However, the reasons for their pride were almost opposite. Much in contrast to Qianlong, Yinlin's mother Juyu was not happy. Even the most beautiful moonrise on a September evening brought her tears, not of a melancholy beauty, but something tragic. For her the moon was not the peaceful glow of companionship, but a tired, pale eye. Juyu interpreted the early struggles of her life quite differently from Qianlong. Juyu was born into a home that had servants. Her father owned several stores, and she had a clear memory of sitting on the front counter of the store as a young child. One of the employees opened a glass jar with many colorful candies inside. "Try some," the clerk coaxed her. "Wow, so beautiful," she thought. Inside the glass jar were many colorfully wrapped little packages of sweetness. She reached in, carefully attempting to select one of each color, pink, yellow, brown, blue, and green, while the clerk watched on. Somewhere in the back of the store, her father attended to business matters, and his voice could be heard among the sounds of shuffling and other movements. As Juyu placed one after another bonbon on the counter, the clerk brought a silk bag with a tie string, placed a handful of extra candies inside, and offered the bag to Juyu. "Here, you can put your candies inside," he said, in a gentle but masculine voice. Juyu had already removed the wrapping from one of the flavored goodies, and with careful accounting placed each one of the remaining candies in the bag. She had just placed a yellow toffee in her mouth, and found another yellow one to replace it. Each of us wakes into consciousness at certain moments in our lives. This moment, the tangy sweetness of the candies, the fresh, sugary scent, the decorative jar with all its reflections of light and color, and being perched like a little princess on the countertop, was Juyu's earliest memory, her waking moment in life. This moment, in her clean white dress with lacy-topped socks and polished shoes, was her earliest memory when she first noticed both herself and the world she lived in. She was a young girl, served by a tall, well-groomed clerk. Tasty objects were her treasure in a kingdom ruled by her father, and she was the princess. It was a happy life, a sweet life, a child's dream. When her father finished his business, he briskly headed to the side entrance of the store. Looking toward the clerk and in a low voice, her father directed that the clerk bring her. The clerk nodded, then lifted Juyu from the counter and placed her on the floor. To one of her hands he offered the bag of candies. To the other hand he offered his own outstretched forefingers. She grasped his fingers, and the clerk slowly walked her through to the door, where a palanquin and 6 bearers were waiting on the street. The clerk lifted Juyu inside and set her beside her mother, who was already fanning herself on the forward-facing seat. Juyu was still too young to know that her father, who followed her into the carriage and sat opposite to Wu Wen, inherited the family business, and that actually they owned 3 stores. She was too young to know that her mother's small and decorative feet, wrapped as attractively as any candy, was a sign of her status as a female, and as a woman devoted to Confucian values. And when they returned home, she ran through the entrance, unaware yet of how large their home was. At her young age, life in the house itself was a yet-to-be-fully explored adventure. Her days were a bliss of ever-new discoveries as she found rooms she hadn't seen before, drawers that concealed various mementos, and doors large and small that she never yet opened. Her days of play gave her a feeling that life was large and inviting. Each day flowed into the next in a dream of endless possibility. Several months later, the family was on their way to their summer house in the country. To Juyu, it seemed that something was different about their move. Something unsettled her and made her alert. Was it because she had noticed for the first time the sour odor of the countryside? Was she able to perceive a difference in the manners of the country neighbors compared to the servants back home? She closed the curtain beside her seat in the shoulder carriage as they traveled, but she could sometimes hear the reluctance of others on the road to make way for their passage. When they arrived at the entrance, she noticed, as she retreated into the hidden chambers of her home, that her father was in some dispute with the bearers of the carriage. But more than anything she noticed as time passed, and she searched from room to room, that there were no longer any servants to prepare her meals or help her with her clothes. Over the coming days she tended to be on her own for long periods, often without eating, and soon decided she didn't like her summer home, and wondered how long before they would go back. No one answered her questions directly. Though their country home was smaller than the one they left in the city, like the city home, it was done in the traditional courtyard style. This structure dominated the landscape, which was otherwise surrounded by many smaller homes, mostly built of mud and bamboo, sometimes kept cool by pasting pig manure on the walls. In contrast to these homes, which were mostly the size of a single room, Juyu's family lived in a compound. The entrance faced south and required that you pass through the ancestral shrine. In the daytime, this set of altars with incense and candles seemed dirty and smelly to Juyu, but every time they passed she was required to bow and pray for their ancestors, whose ashes were displayed on the shelves, and whose images and words hung on the wall. The worst was after sunset. The flickering of candles created an illusion of movement, and a breeze passing through the grating made it seem as if you could hear the ancestors breathing. It felt like a bedroom of death, and the ancestors were whispering to her. Even in the day it was hard for Juyu to pass through this portal without recalling death. She always quickened her pace with goosebumps crawling on her body, either coming in or going out, through this only entrance into the house. Once through the entrance and across the courtyard, to the opposite side, there was a building which housed a large room where there were a number of tables, some high and some low, and various chairs and mats, as well as a large kang. This was the area where the family gathered most frequently, both for socializing and eating. Juyu's mother and father already raised 2 boys. One of them, Ju Zhao, was in the army, and the other, Ju Wei, married several years ago to Lu Ai, and established a family in the country near the summer house. Ju Wei came over with a pot of pork soup and rice. There was talking, but as usual these days, it sounded unhappy. "Always take the big piece?" Juyu's mother said, frowning at Ju Zheng beside her at the table. Father Zheng was already swallowing the meat, eagerly slurping some broth from his bowl. "They are the same size," replied Father. "You just eat." "And what is Yu going to eat?" Father didn't reply. He sat with his legs apart and each foot flat on the floor, as the master at the table, completely absorbed in his soup. Brother Wei offered some words about using the land around the house, and the need to grow their own food. Again, Father didn't reply. He only paused to suck on some tea. He wasn't used to being in such a position. He continued chomping noisily on his soup and rice. Normally, he was commander of a big company, making fateful decisions. But now he had to think about all the low things he had no familiarity with, like how to grow the food he needed, and who will cook it. Life, suddenly reduced to bare necessities, irritated him greatly. Meanwhile, his wife, picking at the bone in her bowl, stared at him, saying in a shrill voice, "Look at this! How do I eat this? You are finishing the one piece of meat that could have been broken into 3 pieces. All I have is a bone." Father was having trouble keeping everything in his mind, and his wife sitting beside him repeating the same thing about eating too much, and his son saying that there were details that needed taking care of, pressed him to his limit. She pushed further. "Do you even think about your family?" "Keep quiet, woman," he shouted. Food flicked out of his mouth and little bits landed on the table. Somewhere in the loud bickering, Juyu came to consciousness. It was morning, and Juyu was playing in her room, unaware that her uncle had come to visit. The conversation filtered through the door into her ears and finally into her body. Juyu was already familiar with the coolness between her mother and father. Back in the city, they did not actually spend so much time in the same room, but there was something new about their manner. It was more abrupt, with less of that formal respect she was used to. The mood did not feel like the holiday away from the city that she anticipated, and the emotional tone, like the theme at the start of a movie, prepared her for the truth that was to come. The government had recently abolished private property and had begun the process of redistribution to serve the revolutionary cause. The Jew family, until recently, had more than one home, and local officials decided that the Jews were to relocate to the country and leave their city home to be repopulated with more deserving people. The day Juyu happily waved goodbye to the house servants, she hadn't noticed their tears, and was not aware that she would never again return to her happy playground in the city. Words from outside her bedroom echoed along the walls where the sun shining through the blinds left sharp shadows. She stopped to listen. Something difficult was happening, and even her father didn't know the solution. "Aye, what are we going to do?" Father Jeng said. Juyu was not accustomed to her father speaking this way. She strained to hear him as his tone was barely audible. "We're getting old now, and we'll need to do something about Yuyu." Yuyu blinked. Her heart pounded as she held her breath. What does it mean, do something about Yuyu? "You can teach Juyu how to cook and clean," Uncle Wei offered. His mother Wu Wen got up from the table and walked with a slight wobble to sit in the chair at the far side, while her husband and son continued their discussion. She was a largish woman and sat with a sigh. "How can your mother do that?" Father Ju replied. "Even your mother has never cooked or cleaned till now. The only thing Yuyu will be is a burden. We need someone to take her." Yuyu's heart started racing. The strangeness of recent days, combined with her memory of the smoky shrine at the entrance, the rudeness of the country people, all accumulated in her mind, and now the danger that she might be separated from her parents, created a hunger inside her that was deeper than anything she felt in her life. She didn't understand that her father was only pretending, and had no desire to give Yuyu away, but hoped that Uncle Wei and Aunt Ai would take responsibility for Yuyu while Father Jen and his wife Wu Wen settled into their new life in the country. Yuyu would be able to bridge relations with Wei and Ai that had been damaged years earlier. The problem was that Father Jen and Mother Wen had never approved of the marriage of Brother Wei and Lu Ai. They looked down on Lu Ai as illegitimate because she was both older than Brother Wei and had been married once already. To their view, she tricked their son into marriage when he could have done much better. Brother Wei, for his part, would have liked to take care of Yuyu, but he had his own children. It was already difficult living on the farm, and bringing Yuyu into their home would only expose Lu Ai to further scorn and abuse from Ju Wei's parents. Brother Wei did not want to face this, and felt it would not be good for anyone, including Yuyu. In order to put an end to such talk, Uncle Wei suggested, "Father, we know someone who could take Yuyu, but they do not live nearby. They are good people. They do not have children and could use an extra set of hands on the farm. They are willing to take a young child as a member of their own family and do the work of teaching her how to be useful. But she would be far away. You might not see her, except perhaps once a year." He knew that such an action would mean that Yu would basically become another family's servant, and the humility of such a thing would be too much to bear. He did not expect his father to agree. Father Ju did not reply. He looked instead to his wife Wen, who returned his look with no expression on her face. Father Ju, who had been used to giving orders and seeming to be the Lord of Fate, found himself at a loss for how to handle this situation. Something snapped in Juyu, and her body moved with purpose. She burst out of the shadows of her room, running across the floor to her mother. Burying her head in her mother's lap with tears and sobs, she cried, "I'm a good cook!" Looking first up into her mother's face and then over to her father, she repeated, "I'm a good cook! And I could clean also. I'm good at cleaning." While almost shouting in her little child voice, she pushed off her mother's lap and in rapid, leaping child steps hasted to where the broom was resting. "Watch me! Look!" she started, sweeping motions in the center of the floor, using both hands to create a long arc. "You see? I'm cleaning. Watch me! Watch!" She continued sweeping the room, leaning one foot forward and then back to her heels. Uncle Wei looked in her direction and said, "Yu, have you ever cooked before? I don't think so." Yu spoke out almost fiercely while still sweeping energetically. "I watch the cooks at home. It's easy to cook. I can do it so good." "You see?" She quickly moved the dust pile and pushed it into the corner of the room. She dropped the broom and, attempting to place a convincing smile on her face, now stained with tears, in a flurry of legs, she picked up a small stool. Placing it at the base of the table, she stood on the stool and reached here and there to arrange the items on the table. "You see? The floor is clean. It's easy. You see how hard I work?" She hurriedly cleared off a few small dishes and knocked one of the cups to the floor. She stopped, looking at her father, and lowered her head, bowing, and then quickly jumped from the stool, set the dishes on a lower table, and picked up the cup, rinsing it in a bucket nearby. Father Zheng looked at Yu. "Come here and bring me that cup," he said. Yu looked over her shoulder and turned to bring the cup. "Give it to me," Father Zheng said. "You cleaned it, right?" Yu nodded her head and quickly shook the water off the cup, wiping her face with the sleeve of one arm. She raised the cup, still shining from wetness, in both hands to her father, while lowering her head once again. "Pour me some tea," he said to her quietly. He gazed directly at her, his dark eyes still, as if peering out from his own shadows, while Yu reached up, sprinkled some tea leaves into the cup, and grabbed the heavy pot in both hands. Father Ju lowered his cup, and Yu raised her arms to pour the tea. Brother Wei watched while Mother Wen just looked down to a cloth she fidgeted with between her hands. She was slowly unwrapping one of her feet. Yu placed the pot down on the near edge of the table with a slight thud and stood back, staring at her father. She wiped her hands on her sides. Father Zheng set the teacup on the table and said, "Thank you, daughter." But Yu didn't rest. Glancing at her mother, she pulled a large basin from under one of the small tables and placed it at her mother's feet. Grabbing a bottle of scented oil, she poured a small amount into the basin. Using the same pot she had just used for tea, Yu poured steaming water into the basin, then transferred a few bowlfuls of cooler water, scooped out of another pot. She mixed the two to create a warm scented water solution, while her mother watched. Standing, Yu reached out, gently pulled the cloth from her mother's hand, then knelt again to unwrap the remainder of her mother's left foot. She slipped the distorted foot into the scented water and then continued by unwrapping the right foot, placing it into the water as well. Slowly she began to rub one foot, then the other, getting the oil into the folds of the skin between and under the toes. While doing so, she gazed up into her mother's eyes with a determined look of love. Wu Wen closed her eyes, and a quiet settled into the room as Father Zheng sipped his tea, admiring his daughter, while trying to comprehend what was happening to their lives. Brother Wei stood from his chair, poured the remaining few vegetables and broth into a bowl, nodding to Yu Yu, saying, "There's soup here." Yu Yu didn't look over, but kept her gaze focused on her mother, whose eyes still remained shut. Yu Yu tilted her head slightly, let her eyelids droop a bit, and said, "I will eat after Mum and Baba are taken care of." Wu Wen opened her eyes slightly, gazing down at her daughter with a watery gaze, but then closed them once again. This was Ju Yu's second awakening. It made her first awakening in the store sampling candy seem to be no awakening at all, but a dream that was long forgotten. Any goodness to come into her life in the future would never again trick her like the candy in the store. From that day forward, Yu Yu remained awake to the harshness of her life, and became the young caretaker of her mother and father. She was only a child, but she had, in fact, watched the cooks carefully back at their home in the city, and she also had a natural instinct about what sort of work needed to be done. Though she lacked physical strength, she was already sharp-witted and had boundless energy. Strength and experience came to her over time, and she became very good at her job. She was a city girl, however, and her classmates isolated her for her city manners and too careful concern about dirt and smell. Despite their judgments and the social isolation it caused, she would sleep by the side of the road so that the passing of people early in the morning would wake her before the dawn. While the pale moon hung in the sky, she would race to the fields to gather chicken manure, which she gave to an agent to be weighed and counted. If she got a large enough amount of chicken manure, she would be given her daily food ticket, and this would increase the family's supply. Once her morning work was completed, she would return home, wash off the smell, then go to school, then return home to clean and cook. She was a determined and proficient girl. Her mother and father never had to clean or cook. She took care of them as her childhood passed, from one episode of hard work to another, gathering chicken manure, washing, cooking, cleaning, going to school, gathering food, cooking, cleaning, washing, studying, sleeping. At night, as she lay in the dirt near the walking path, she calculated how she could gather more manure than the other children the next day. Yinlin, together with her father, looking at the bath photo, would, as time passed, come to know the difficult early life of both her parents. As she remembered the sparkle and splash of that warmy bath, surrounded by love and attention, she did not know yet that she would have her own story. She simply thought about the fun life she had at the barracks. It was her awakening, and life for Yinlin was just beginning. On the other side of the planet, in a world far removed from anything Chinese, young Bobby sits with his knees folded under his stomach in the middle of the floor, gazing at his baby photo. On the right side of the photo stands a woman whose presence is only indicated from the waist up. Her face is not in the picture. It is Bobby's grandmother. She is a stout woman in an apron-covered dress that Bobby remembers as blue with little white flowers. Bobby is sitting in a round white Tupperware tub, normally used for mixing flour, but now it serves as his bath. Bobby is at the age where it is difficult to completely balance his head on the top of his body. You can hear his chubby legs swish back and forth in the water, and observe as his toes open and close, coos of excitement. His hands are firmly gripping the sides of the tub, and his eyes are wide in pure sensation and pleasure. He has the appearance of a rider sitting in the first basket of a roller coaster as it surmounts that most exhilarating drop into eternity. The tub is on the kitchen table. It is not hard to imagine the odors of toast and coffee, and the buttery onion scent of pierogies being prepared for dinner. The grandmother's supportive hands no longer remain in this world. They are only captured here in this old photo album, its plastic coil spine curling through thick pages, covered in clear but now yellowing plastic film, stiffened over time. Each page, front and back, has thin strips of gluing that hold the photos in place, and the vellum seals it like insects in amber. Photos of a time and place that do not exist anymore, but from which everything is connected. It was once an empty book on a general store shelf, but life keeps pressing into it like wild grass, spreading in a newly tilled plot of land. At the time just prior to Bobby's birth, his father Ben was living and working over 700 miles west, close to his mother and father in Dawson Creek, a small city on the eastern border of central British Columbia. Should he decide to visit his pregnant wife Hannah, he would need to drive east into Alberta about 6 hours before arriving in Edmonton. There he could get some lunch at a gas stop cafe somewhere, fuel up, and travel another 6 hours directing his car further east to Weldon, a small hamlet about 1 hour south of the South Saskatchewan River. If he traveled in winter, he would leave in the darkness of the morning, and would arrive in the darkness of the evening with a warm meal awaiting him. As he was a very young man, and since there was a baby coming, Ben needed to work to develop the Smitty's restaurant he recently purchased, while Hannah stayed with her family in Weldon. Hannah was not feeling well that first Saturday of the new year. The height of her adolescent changes, combined with the swollen sausage feeling of pregnancy, made her body feel like an intrusive foreign object. It was impossible to find a position that made her comfortable. The sun set in the late afternoon, and cold began to creep into dark corners of the house. Hannah's mother used the extender handle to hook an iron lid off the coal stove surface, inspecting the flames within. Satisfied, she tossed a tissue into the fire, then replaced the lid into the fitting. She slid a pot heaped with snow into place for boiling potatoes. The snow soon began to melt while steam rose, producing cool humidity as it spread to the windows, crystallizing into glittery smears of reflected light. The temperature outside was 14 Fahrenheit and dropping. Perhaps it would reach 0 tonight, which would not be bad for January. It could be much colder. Hannah pulled the blanket up around her neck as she tried to make herself comfortable on the couch. The smell of cabbage, onions, and sausages frying, the sound of her mother's feet sliding on the floor and the creaking floorboards, gave her a sense of safety, while doing nothing to end the physical discomfort. It had been colder on her birthday last November, Hannah thought to herself, and there were no presents for her that day as usual since her father didn't allow such selfish holidays. He had his reasons and was happy to explain to her, but no matter what he said, it always felt unfair. All her friends got presents on their birthdays, and so did her cousins, and they were Christians. so she couldn't be convinced that God opposed the birthday presents. Every time her birthday came around, Hannah hoped that this year would be different. Perhaps this day, because of the challenges of the year, because she was carrying a child in her womb, or because she had been deprived of the grade 8 schooling and social engagement she might have had, perhaps this time her father would surprise her with a thoughtful gift. The day began mildly promising. Her father was at home that morning, and her mother was preparing a lunch of buns with various cold meats, cheese, and mayonnaise for 1 o'clock. Canned pickles from garden cucumbers and beets were set in dishes, and a crocheted tablecloth had been spread. Her father was in his office putting leaflets into envelopes. Her 2 aunts, Julia and Pauline, would soon arrive, and with their arrival lend a little festivity to the day. Around 12:50, just minutes before the aunts were to arrive, the phone rang. Hannah jumped to answer it. "Hello?" "Hello, is that Hannah?" The voice on the other end had the slightly strained rasp that often accompanies the voice of someone who makes his living by talking. It was her older brother Danny calling from Toronto. In those days, long-distance phone calls sounded far away, as if through a long tube. "Yes," replied Hannah loudly. She loved her brother and was always happy to hear his voice, but her loud excitement indicated to those around that she was in a long-distance call. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" he offered. "Yes, my 15th, she said, too nervous to know what else to say. "I will always remember your birthday," he said with a warm smile in his voice. He tried to be sensitive about the pregnancy and only said, "How are you feeling these days?" "Okay," she replied. Actually, she didn't really want to talk about the baby, but at least when he asked, she didn't feel embarrassed. Rather, she had the slight hope that his goodwill alone might remove her from her circumstances. But then followed a tone of somber care. "Listen, Hannah, I'm sorry to end the call so early, but I need to talk to Dad. Can you put him on the line?" "Uh-huh," she said. Though she was disappointed by such an abrupt end to the conversation, she was also worried. Her father had already heard the call and soon took over the phone. "Is that Danny?" he asked, while taking the phone from Hannah. Her father Alexander's voice was always loud, but on the phone it was booming. "Hello! Is that Danny? Danny! How are you? Where are you calling from?" While he settled in the chair beside the phone with his manly sense of importance, there was a knock on the door, and after the slightest pause, Auntie Julia came in with Auntie Pauline. The entrance was just the other side of a small dividing wall, where Alexander was on the phone. The 2 aunts entered the house, completely engaged in an animated conversation about a problem Julia was having with the neighbor's dog, who always came to her yard, leaving yellow stains and brown packages in the snow in front of her house. She was so disgusted with it. They entered while Alexander was already speaking loudly on the phone, and they automatically raised their voices in order to hear each other, causing Alexander's tone to rise as well. It was an instant hubbub. Alex peered around the corner, eagerly indicating that he was on a long-distance call. The 2 of them nodded, then smiled to Hannah, who stood watching them. Both of them had such pale skin and such white hair that they brought an angelic presence with them. "Hello, darling," Auntie Julia said to her. Julia's eyes were small, but her face shone with brilliance. She leaned down and planted a wet kiss on Hannah's cheek. Auntie Pauline was more conserved. She smiled, but also sighed with down-turned eyebrows as she looked for a place to drop her large black purse. Meanwhile, Alexander's voice on the phone had come to a stop. He sat by the phone, his head hanging, each hand propped on either leg. He had a look of a sagging tent. "What is wrong?" Julia asked, as Pauline sat on the couch, her spectacles reflecting the room. "I just spoke with Danny," he said. "President Kennedy has been assassinated." "Oh," Julia said. "Dear." She dropped into one of the kitchen chairs, her care turning quickly to worry, her eyes turning to tiny pools of liquid. Hannah's father went to the living room, turned on the radio a bit louder than usual. He sat down, but soon rose again to pace the living room and stare out the living room window, only to sigh, pace around again, and sit. This restless behavior persisted until finally he once again sat, his eyes disappearing either to stare at the floor or gaze out the window. Frequently he wiped his eyes. From that point, the day progressed by degrees into a gloom of tears, hushed conversations, and continuous reference to the drama playing out on the radio. Neighbors came by. They cried. They prayed. It seemed the world was suddenly threatened with a great evil, and Hannah, whose birthday was never really celebrated, added this mood of death to mark her special day. Hannah retreated to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, gazing absent-mindedly at her mystery books. She had read them already, and found no solution there for the lump in her throat. She picked up her white church Bible with the little cross dangling on the zipper. It felt dry like a bland crust of bread in her hands. She pulled on the zipper and, flipping the pages, let it rest open on Romans. Her eyes landed on chapter 12, verse 12. "Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer." She read the verse, but it didn't register. It seemed to her like her father's talking. She set the Bible down on her bed and placed her hand on her raised belly, now only a month or so from birth. "I'm going to make sure you have birthdays, and Christmas, and all the holidays," she whispered. At some point, Auntie Julia gently knocked on the door and came inside. She sat down on the bed beside Hannah, handing her a piece of homemade Saskatoon pie. It was November, but this pie was made with berries picked last summer down by the river. The crust of the pie was light and fluffy, and made with skilled hands already spotted with age. Julia patted Hannah's leg, and bent her face around to look into Hannah's eyes directly. It was obvious from the redness around her eyes that Auntie Julia had been crying. Julia was a very sensitive aunt. She could not help being distressed by the death of Kennedy, but she did not forget Hannah either. She patted Hannah's leg, snuck a smile, and with bright gray eyes wished her happy birthday. "It must be very difficult and confusing to you right now, dear. It is your birthday, and you are going to soon have your own baby. You are young, and there is so much hope for a good life, but everyone around you is crying their eyes out and being so serious. Try to enjoy this pie, sweetheart. I warmed it on the stove, and there is ice cream here. God loves you, dear, and so do I. All your family loves you, your aunts, your mother and father, and your brother and sister, and cousins. It is a world of love, but you are only seeing the smallest tip of it right now. Try not to worry, dear. Everything will be all right, okay? Eat this pie. I made it for you." She stayed a while, smiling and sitting beside Hannah while she ate her pie. Compared to the white Bible, this pie was the only thing to give Hannah courage. It was so delicious, and the taste of it was love. To her it was a lit window on a dark night. The memories of pie on her birthday comforted Hannah as she came back in her mind to this Saturday in January, and the awareness that she would soon be experiencing a new kind of birthday. In a matter of days, or perhaps even hours, she thought, as she stared into the darkness outside, she would be the mother of her own child. Her father was preparing for a trip and had just returned into the house after running a few errands. Hearing him stamp the snow off his feet and the rubber sound of galoshes squeaking, Hannah pulled a letter out from under the blanket and read it for the third time, or perhaps the fourth now. It was a letter from her niece who lived in Fort St. John, about an hour northwest of Dawson Creek. Her mother, Lena, was Hannah's sister. Lena was 18 years old when Hannah was born, and had already started a substantial family of her own. Any time their dusty old Buick pulled up for a visit, a flow of energy in the shape of many children's bodies would burst out the doors. Hannah had several nieces and nephews by her sister, and all of them were near to her in age, most older and a few younger. The letter she was now reading was written by Tiffany, the niece nearest to her in age, and every bit as much a friend as she was family. Sitting on the couch, Hannah read the letter describing how Tiffany's family had spent their Christmas. She spoke of how busy the church was and of the tiresomeness of all the meetings. She spoke of having to help her mother with cooking and the annoying boy whose family was invited to share the Christmas Eve meal. She listed some of the presents that were given and received, and she closed the letter with wishes for the love of Jesus in all that is to come. Nothing was mentioned about the baby's anticipated arrival, but Hannah could tell she was getting support. This was important to Hannah, as her sister Lena took several opportunities to get Hannah by herself and tell her what a burden this child would be to the family, and that it was far better to give it up for adoption. The child would have a much greater hope for a good life, and Hannah would be able to finish her schooling. These conversations were always awkward and made Hannah feel some unnameable distress. Dinner was served. Hannah came to the table and listened to her father talk about some gossip he had picked up at Harvey's, the only general store in town. The Harveys knew everyone who came and went, and always welcomed people with a juicy bit of do-tell. Alexander, like many of the town folk, liked to come into the shop just to pour himself a cup of coffee and enjoy the banter and intrigue one expected upon entering the door. "Hey there, Mr. Hicks," Mrs. Harvey would say. "How's the carpentry business treating you? Are you still enjoying Mrs. Hicks' crabapple jam?" Such inquiries would soon enough lead to a phrase that began, "Have you heard about?" or, "Tragic what's been going on with." This afternoon the topic was, "So sad what's been happening at the Thompson house, did you hear?" The Thompsons were the young Aboriginal family who lived in the northwest corner of town along the highway heading north. Someone said that Wendy had been chasing her husband around outside the house the previous evening with a butcher knife. There had been a big scene with lots of shouting while the neighbors hid in their homes, peeking through curtains and pacing up and down darkened halls. Hannah's father chewed on this gossip with her mother, and the general conclusion was drawn that the family seemed quite unhappy, and that they really should do something about all that drinking. The food was eaten, the dishes were cleared, the last coffee was poured. Within 30 minutes the lamps were shut, as gradually the inner darkness of the home began to correspond to the darkness outside. The walls and floorboards began to creak and bump as the cold slowly penetrated into the house. In this part of town there were yet no street lights, and all that could be seen was the moonlit glow of the snow-covered field across the way, casting long midnight shadows. It was growing very quiet, and Hannah's discomfort did not ease. In fact, it got worse, until many hours later, in a 6-bedroom hospital on the other side of the farmer's field, a child was born. They named him Bobby. It was fitting, perhaps, that Hannah was taken to the hospital under the cover of night. Hannah, having a child at such a young age, invited concern from all her neighbors, and her name was no doubt spoken over cups of coffee at Harvey's. "It's such a pity what Hannah got herself into. Imagine what her family must be going through," they would worry. "Now she has all this responsibility. Just think what's ahead for the poor child." "Which child?" someone joked. A bit of subdued laughter would be followed by a more philosophical attitude about how society is changing and whatnot. On such talk went. And though Hannah was confined to her family's home, which was not well insulated against the cold whisper of winter, it was nevertheless thought to be appropriate that Hannah keep a low profile. She should not go prancing about town in her condition. She should display an appropriate amount of shame and responsibility for the new child. In the small and uncomfortable space of her parents' home, Hannah lived with her mother, who barely spoke, and with a father who was deeply religious, devoting himself to causes that deprived him of a path to any kind of material prosperity for him and his family. Often he would leave home and go on weeks-long religious ventures of one sort or another. And into this world, devoid of anything to charm a young girl, a child was born, a child who represented the failure of living up to her family's values, as well as the surrounding community. Yet this same child inspired a devotion in Hannah that was lacking until now. And as she worked her way through the winter months, some days as immature teenager, and other days as rapidly maturing mother, and as the snows melted into spring and the town set about planting new crops, Hannah's love for this child grew, and so did her world. Yes, some people long for a life that is simple and planned. As Yinlin and Bobby began their lives, they were already passengers on an adventure that hardly seemed simple. Yet everyone had a hope that this would change. As both Canada and China grew in the world of nations, life stabilized and had a hopeful tendency toward predictability and security. Tied with a ribbon. China believed itself headed toward its communist utopia, and Canada believed itself to be a shining example of the modern world, gentle friends of the great neighbor next door. Some people won't sail the sea 'cause they're safer on land. Yinlin in her glittery bath, and Bobby holding the rails of his tub in wide-eyed enthusiasm. At this point of their lives they could only see what was immediately before them. To follow what's written. That is the life of children. But I'd follow you to the great unknown.